We'll just wait for a few people to come in. And our sound check worked, which is lovely. We'll just wait for a few people to see. It's an echo. Okay. Oh yeah, so people are filtering in, and hello everyone, thanks for joining. We'll just give it another minute or two because we don't like to be too early. Although yeah, we're a tiny bit behind time. So I might actually, just kick it off because I know it's late in Ireland too for Dr. Kelly. So welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have with us Dr. Brendan Kelly, who is Professor of Psychiatry at Trinity College Dublin and a Consultant Psychiatrist at Tala University Hospital Dublin. I meant to say I know loads of radiographers there because I went to college in University in UCD with and lived with 3 girls who were in the radiography department, and there was only 14 students in the entire year, so I knew them all. Dr. Kelly has authored and co-authored over 300 publications in peer-reviewed journals. He has over 600 or 21 book chapters and book contributions and 17 books, 11 of which he is the sole author. I do not know where you find all the time, Dr. Kelly. So we are tonight talking about his most recent book, Asylum Inside Grangegorman. Dr. Kelly is a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, as well as Trinity College Dublin. In 2018, he became the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Law and Psychiatry, and in 2020, he was elected, librarian at the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland. So an absolutely jam-packed plate. You're kind of giving me anxiety. I thought I was busy, but so I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Kelly, and thank you very much to talk to us about the history of the Lunatic Asylum in Ireland. I'm just going to spotlight you and mute myself now.
Thank you very much indeed. And you will alert me if the sound goes or anything, will you? Because I'll just keep chatting away no matter what. Thank you. So look, thank you very much for inviting me along, and thanks to you all for attending. And, my name is Brendan Kelly. I'm talking to you from Dublin, and the title of the talk is here on the screen, The History of the Lunatic Asylum in Ireland. And I'm going to use this kind of language throughout the presentation and as I talk, because it is the language used at the time. So this is by no means to endorse this kind of language at all, but it's incredibly important in my view that we do not deny this language being used in the past as well. So there are inverted commas here, but there are not throughout, but this is very much historic language. This is the recent book, I think, that triggered this invitation as best as I can figure. It's called Asylum Inside Grangegorman, and the Royal Irish Academy published it here in Dublin. And Grangegorman, of the title, it refers to an old psychiatric hospital here in Dublin, Grangegorman, also known as St. Brendan's as it happens, but it was located in Grangegorman, and it's now out of use, at least as a psychiatric hospital. So for about 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk through a few things. The beginning of the Irish asylum system, what happened during the 1800s, and then a little talk about 2 interesting figures, and then the 1900s and where we are now. So interestingly, and I know all countries have their histories with asylums. Maybe state mental hospitals might be a more familiar phrase. But in Ireland here, it started with this hospital, which still operates in Dublin, called St. Patrick's Hospital. And it was founded in 1745 following a bequest by Jonathan Swift, the Irish writer of Gulliver's Travels and other stories, who left in his will a bequest, and this became Ireland's first mental hospital as such, or asylum. Now, this was only one establishment, and across the rest of Ireland, most people with what we now call mental illness did not have any care whatsoever, as was the case in many parts of the world. And, people sometimes imagine that at this point, before we built these hospitals, that people with mental illness, were cared for by families or, were looked after in villages. But the truth is a lot more like this. In 1817, a committee of the Irish House of Commons heard evidence about what happened this was in County Mayo in the west of Ireland. The MP giving evidence said that when a strong man or woman gets the complaint, that is what we would now call mental illness, the way they manage. Now, this is before there were asylums. This was in a cabin in a family home in the west of Ireland. If someone got mental illness, the way they manage is they make a hole in the floor of the cabin, not high enough for the person to stand up in, with a crib over it to prevent his getting up. The hole is about 5 feet deep, and they give this person their food there, and there they die. So before we built these hospitals that I am going to be very critical of in a few moments, they do need to be put in a little bit of context that prior to them, there was neglect of people, what came to be called lunatics in a very severe way. So the impulse to build these hospitals was a very humanitarian one. So in the early 1800s, this is the cover of a book published in Cork in 1810, and it is written by a very prominent doctor in Cork at the time. Now, I'm not certain if my little arrow comes up on the screen there, does it? It does. So it was written by William Halloran, who was a doctor in Cork in the south of Ireland. And he wrote this book in 1810 because he was worried about the extraordinary addition to the number of insane. And again, this is very much language of the times, the word insane. And so he wrote this book in 1810, and it was the first Irish textbook, certainly, and one of the early European textbooks. And it outlined the treatment approach that was recommended, and this was known as moral management. And this treatment approach was focused on the doctor-patient relationship, having a nice environment, a good diet, and people should exercise and be occupied working on a farm in the asylum or working activity was deemed helpful. And this was as opposed to people being locked in the pit at home or in some kind of private establishment. So this was a book in 1810 published in Cork. Now, he also recommended a certain kind of treatment. And this image is from Halloran's book. And you can see here, there are two patients in this image. One of them is strapped into a chair here. The other one is strapped into a sort of a bed, a hammock type thing here. And this is an asylum attendant turning a wheel so that these people rotate very quickly, maybe 60 rotations per minute. So turning about completely within 1 second. And this was known as the circulating chair. And as well as the other more enlightened sounding kinds of treatment, Halloran recommended this. And these spread all over Europe and parts of the US in the early part of the 19th century. So Halloran's textbook, along with the belief that insanity was increasing, prompted the authorities to build what was called the Richmond Asylum. And this became Grangegorman Asylum, and this is what my book is about. So they built this asylum to meet the needs of the growing number of insane people. And then it was followed by a whole bunch of other establishments. You can see here in Derry and Belfast and Limerick, all over Ireland, we built lots of these mental hospitals. And so that's how it started. Real concern about neglect, basically. And then they built these hospitals. Here's a picture of the Richmond District Asylum in the 1850s. This became Grangegorman and later called St. Brendan's, and it was in Dublin, the biggest of the Irish asylums. But they were all over Ireland. Now, those of you with familiarity with parts of Ireland, this is a big asylum in Armagh. And those of you not familiar with Ireland at all, these bore a lot of resemblance to some of the state hospitals in the United States, in that they were very large. They often had a number of buildings, a campus, a farm, all kinds of industry to support the huge numbers of patients, 1,000, 2,000 patients, 2,500 patients. So this was Armagh. There was a very large one in Belfast. You can see the size of the front of the building. That's completely demolished now. Here was the asylum in Carlow, St. Dimpnas, another very large institution. And this one in Ballinasloe, in County Galway in the west of Ireland. And this was one of the really big ones. And to give you some feeling for how big, the town of Ballinasloe had a population of about 5,100 people in the town. And of those 5,100 people, around 2,400 were patients in the asylum. So you had approximately half of the population of the town were patients in the asylum. And then, of course, the other half, they either worked in it, they had a family member who worked in it, or they supplied it, or they had a family member who was a patient. So you had these huge institutions. And really, everyone wanted to keep them open, and everyone wanted them big. They were economic powerhouses for the community, and generations of families worked in them. And so towns competed to get asylums built in them. The building contracts alone were enormous. That's Ballinasloe. Here's a magnificent building in Kilkenny, which still stands. And look at that. Look at just the sheer size of that asylum in Omagh, built in 1853. This is one in County Westmeath, another, just these enormous buildings. That's still standing as well. Here's Sligo. That's now been converted into a hotel. The one in Downpatrick, a slightly later style, you can see there. Another enormous asylum in Letterkenny in County Donegal, up at the north of the country. And look at that. I mean, honestly, Enniscorthy, look at the size of that asylum. Like, it's just such an amazing thing. And it's now unused, of course, and it was sold a few years ago. And you could have bought that enormous building and its grounds for approximately 700,000 euros a few years back, which is an interesting sum of money. It's a lot of money. But on the other hand, it's an enormous building. But on the other hand, it's in a state of absolute decrepitude and requires millions to make it into anything. So anyway, so I'm just showing you some of these to give you an idea of the scale in a country the size of Ireland. Here's one in Ennis in County Clare in the west of Ireland, and that's still standing and still operating to some degree. So we had all of these huge asylums built. You can see there the big era was in the 1800s. Following from Grangegorman at the start of that century, and then they spread all across Ireland. And if you travel through Ireland now, you'll often come across one of these buildings, maybe partially derelict, maybe partially used for other purposes now. There were other treatments. There was hydrotherapy. This was basically a sort of a shower bath. That person there is seated in a bath. You can see the view from above. It's just the person's head sticking out. And this is cold water, obviously, and it would be poured continuously on the person. And the person might be left in the bath for, 24, 36 hours, possibly in cold water. And up to a ton of water could be poured down on them over that period of time. So hydrotherapy could be very, very strenuous indeed. Back in Dublin in Grangegorman, and I go into this in the book, one of the resident medical superintendents there, Joseph Lawler, he believed that water therapy and spinning people on chairs was not the way to go, and believed that teaching people to read and write was the most valuable treatment for lunacy, to use the word of the time. Education and training are the basis of the moral treatment of all classes of insane. So he set up a school in the asylum to teach everyone how to read and write, which was, obviously very helpful. Even so, this is a paper from 1894, and you can just see the title of it, The Increase of Insanity. We've always had this belief that we're going through a mental health crisis. We hear it today all the time, but it is a constant through history as well. And in 1894, they said Ireland was going through a crisis, and the increase in certified lunatics in Ireland was 60% compared to much less. Now, but this figure, this needs to be put very much into context, because as these asylums were being built, they offered accommodation and they offered food and security. And, they were being built during the era of the famine and famines. So they were very attractive. And getting certified as a lunatic, it had its pluses. It often meant a long period in the mental hospital. But on the other hand, what was outside wasn't exactly great either. So the increase in certified lunatics, it certainly doesn't reflect increased mental illness or increased insanity. It's a very social thing at this time, because obviously the Great Famine in Ireland was 1839 to 18, sorry, it was in the 1840s. But we need to bear in mind that the periods either side of that, were almost famine-like as well, very often. So during this period, the asylum was attractive. Perhaps the most interesting thing about all those buildings I showed you just there, those big institutions, is that they weren't run by the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church had nothing to do with the asylums. And the asylums were bigger than all Ireland's other institutions put together at any moment. So in the 1900s, for example, we had about 20,000 people in mental hospitals in Ireland, about 20,000. And if you added together all the people in prison, plus Magdalene laundries, plus mother and baby homes, plus orphanages, plus industrial schools, they never came to more than 10,000 at any given moment. So if you like, these non-church run institutions, the mental hospitals, were easily the biggest, more than double everything else put together. And this is, of course, I'm kind of jumping ahead a bit, but it is a very uncomfortable fact for many Irish historians who have a very, very fixed or very limited view of Irish history, that all institutions and indeed all evil is attributable to the Roman Catholic Church. And it's simply not the case. We were perfectly capable of building huge institutions and putting each other in them in large numbers without any involvement of the Roman Catholic Church. And for those listening, that's in no way to take away from those institutions run by the Church, which were indeed cold and cruel and have been reviewed and looked into and examined to a degree. But it is interesting in terms of size that the mental hospitals were always way, way bigger than everything else. And it's partly because of this panic that people were becoming very mentally ill. There were some more private institutions. In 1810, the Quaker community founded an asylum in Dublin called Bloomfield. And also those two other ones I'm showing also in Dublin were founded by another Quaker family, and they still operate all of these, but just in slightly different guises. They're mainly care of the elderly facilities and so forth. But if you like, there was some religious involvement, but not from the Roman Catholic Church, I guess is the point I'm making there. So that's what happened in the 1800s, and it continued well into the 1900s. So I just want to mention two people, because people like people. And these are two interesting figures in the history of Grangegorman, which is the asylum I've been writing about. This man was Dr. Connolly Norman, and he was resident medical superintendent at Grangegorman District Asylum in Dublin in those years. And he was a tremendously interesting man. He was very disturbed by the size of the asylum, which now had about 1,700 people in it. And it was so crowded, they built another one a little outside Dublin for the overflow called St. Ita's in Portrane. And soon that had 1,300 people. So Connolly Norman just was very distressed by this, and he instigated a scheme called boarding out, whereby patients could spend periods of months outside the hospital with their own family or another, and there would be a small payment. But this was shut down very quickly by the government, who they wanted the asylums big. They were huge economic boons to their communities. So poor old Connolly Norman's efforts to decant some patients out, even for a while, they were blocked. And then the government really did a really interesting thing, because the doctors were constantly trying to discharge patients from the asylums. So the government, what it did was very clever, and what it always does really, it changed the salary scales so that the more patients were in your asylum, the more you were paid. And that doctors were very ethical and all that, but we are also humans, and that changed things a little bit. Connolly Norman persisted, and interestingly, any scholars of Joyce, Connolly Norman is one of the 2 asylum doctors mentioned in Ulysses. He's mentioned usually around page 6 or page 7. So you don't have to. So for all of you who don't get very far reading Ulysses, you should manage to make it to page 6 or page 7, where you find Connolly Norman. And the other asylum doctor mentioned is Dr. Eustace, one of the Quaker, who founded one of the Quaker asylums. But that's way deep into Ulysses. I think very few people actually get that far. So in any case, Connolly Norman was working at Grangegorman, and the place was huge. It was so big it had its own fire brigade, its own fire officers. That was the because fires were such a big problem. It had its a staff cricket team, which you can see there in a nice image. There's another picture of the cricket team in Grangegorman mental hospitals, and they had sports days. Here's their sports day in 1901. Now, you mightn't be able to read that on the screen, but the president of the sports day was Dr. Connolly Norman, and there were the various judges. Now, the events. Oh yes, there was some music, playing songs from William Tell and Falstaff, and the wearing of the green, and the events. The high jump for patients, the long jump. I think that's throwing things. Is it putting shots? Putting, I don't know, bigger ones. And then the attendants, who were the workers there, also had their own competition. So Sports Day was a very big thing. And that's the program from 1901, when Grangegorman was called the Richmond Asylum at the time. So so we're looking at about 1,700 patients in the asylum at that point. Here from a couple of years earlier, they had some entertainment, a smoking concert, with musical accompaniments. And here's some of the music. Call Me Back Again by James Clear, Jerusalem Cuckoo, various songs. It's quite the program, isn't it? 30 songs. They're all being sung by this person here. So the asylum had sports, and it had these concerts and dramatic entertainments from time to time. Oh, here we go again. Here we have an afternoon performance in the Richmond Lunatic Asylum in Grangegorman in 1901. And we have a piano. We have an eccentric comedian, followed by comedy artists, a facial mimic, Harry Edson and his dog, Doc, whatever that might be, comedians and dancers. So they did bring in entertainments for the patients from time to time. And the final one I have is from 1901, which is a grand concert again. And you can see from this program, all of these come from the National Archives, the most wonderful archives. This included a recital, a recitation of the Charge of the Light Brigade by Professor Edgar. This sounds like a time when professors had a lot more dignity and status than they have now, talking into their computers at 10:30 at night. And I wouldn't mind reciting the charge of the Light Brigade next time, although I'm sensing there won't be one. Anyway, so look, this was the asylum, and I'm showing you this plot of it here to make a couple of points. This was the asylum building in Dublin in Grangegorman at the time. And right here next door was the North Dublin Union Workhouse. So this was basically a poorhouse. And there was a network of these around the country for people who are poverty stricken and often ill or somehow troubled. And you can see it's right next door to the asylum. So at any point, around 30% of the admissions to the asylum came straight from the workhouse. It's like they were actually connected. So you had people moving between these institutions. And just up here, you had the prison. You had the Richmond Penitentiary, the female prison was here. And again, you had people from the prison being sent to the asylum, to the workhouse, to the asylum, to the prison. They're kind of bouncing around these institutions for reasons which from the records are not terribly clear. And, you know, there were these strange incentives. So, for example, apparently the food was better in the asylum compared to either the workhouse or the prison. So there was a bit of a clamor to get into the asylum just because the food was better. And a lot of these people didn't have anywhere else to go in any case. And you can see here the close relationship again on this slightly different map, the prison, the asylum, and the workhouse. And there we go with the, you can see the connections there between the workhouse, the asylum, and the prison. And people just moving between these three closely knit institutions. And, you know, even see, we have a fever hospital down here and a surgical hospital here. So this part of Dublin was just full of these big institutions with people bouncing around between them. Interestingly, the workhouse is now a hostel for homeless people. So it's serving a very similar function, even a long time later. And that's actually a picture of it right there. And in 1907, just to bring us up a little closer to the current date, the asylum sent across a committee to the workhouse to see why were they getting so many people sent to them. And in 1907, the committee from the asylum found that the female ward in the workhouse right beside the asylum was more like a dungeon. The patients had to take their meals in that repellent room. The male wards were much overcrowded and people being spoon-fed. So very often, looking at the records, what I see are people who clearly had a stroke, a cerebrovascular accident, and were now disabled, and they got put in the workhouse and sometimes put in the asylum, not because they were particularly poor or mentally ill. And of course, the committee said that even though the asylum was well overcrowded, that the workhouse was even worse, and all lunatics, again that word, had to be moved from the workhouse into the asylum. And that's what the workhouse looked like. People were literally living in that degree of crowdedness. So yeah, I can understand why they wanted to move them into the asylum. The other person I want to mention very briefly is a Dr. Eleonora Fleury, who worked in Grangegorman as well. And the reason I'm going to mention her, there she is in the picture there in the middle. It's a picture dominated by men, but the asylums employed women doctors much earlier than other parts of the health system did. And this is our friend Connolly Norman. And this is interesting because at that time, women were not allowed to join the Medical Psychological Association. So basically, they couldn't become, if you like, psychiatrists or fully qualified, because that was the rule. The rule was it was only men. But in 1893, Connolly Norman here proposed Eleonora Fleury, who was really accomplished, top of her class, gold medal winning. And he proposed her to join the Medical Psychological Association. And the association refused automatically because she was a woman. But he appealed it. And in 1894, Eleonora became what we believe to be the first female psychiatrist in the world. We cannot find a record from any other country of earlier admission of a woman to the equivalent associations. So she's quite an important figure and also very interesting figure. She worked at the Overflow Asylum in Portrane, near Dublin. Another huge big asylum. Look at that. Look at that scheme of where Eleonora Fleury worked. But Eleonora was a mischief maker in a fairly serious way. Without getting into too much Irish history, she was adamantly opposed to the treaty, which led to the Civil War. And she had an asylum at her disposal. So she would bring wounded, anti-treaty activists and Republicans into the asylum and treat their wounds, look after them, feed them, get them back on their feet. She would do this at Grangegorman and also when she moved out to St. Ita's here. And if you look at that image, it's like it's made for hiding people in. She could take in these fugitives and they would never be found. And there were so many rooms and nooks and crannies. And those of you who are interested in history, you can consult online the Irish military archives. They're very open and they're really interesting. And if you look up Eleonora Fleury, you find all kinds of things she was at. So, for example, she was hiding. This is from a statement in the military archives in Ireland. When she was working in Portrane in that asylum I showed you just there, and the Free State troops, so these would be the pro-treaty troops, they'd swoop on the asylum, and the men on the run that Fleury was hiding, they used to go out around the grounds and were mistaken for mental patients. So she'd send them out into the yard and tell them to act strangely so that they wouldn't get arrested. Mr. Cosgrave's government found this out and put an end to it because they just ruined all the fun about everything. And so Dr. Fleury got arrested. She was interned for 6 months, but the internment was right at the back of the Richmond Asylum, and the internment wasn't very serious. So she used to hop out over the wall into the asylum and then hop back into the internment camp beside the asylum. Now, she wasn't the only one who was at this kind of thing. In St. Bridget's in Ballinasloe, remember I mentioned that was the really big one that totally dominated its town. This person, Ada English, she was a doctor working there for some decades, and she too opposed the treaty. So she had a different tack. What she did is any Irishman who would resign from the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the British police force in Ireland, if she could persuade any Irishman to resign from that, she would give him a job for life in St. Bridget's Asylum. Which was a great job to get. It was for life, you were pensioned and your children would probably inherit the job. So she used the institution to undermine, locally undermine British governance in Ireland. So that's why I called that book, which came out a few years ago, Patriot and Psychiatrist. She was an activist, really, and she was elected to the second Dáil as well, Ada. But even when that public part of her activism ended, she remained really quite the operator undermining the British police force. And again, for those of you interested in women's history, this is my last one of these. Kathleen Lynn was another, not a psychiatrist, but another doctor who founded St. Ultan's Hospital. And just this week, her diaries have been published. A really glorious book for those of you interested in Irish history, and a lovely gift, although not as good as my book, actually. I should emphasize very, very strongly, this should be the second book you buy after you have bought Asylum. And that's the Asylum Workers Union. So look, I'm just going to bring us a little bit up to date now, if that's okay, because I've been talking for ages and ages. So what happened in the 1900s? So at this point, Ireland had all these huge asylums all over the country. And they had their football teams, their fire brigades, and so forth. A big change came to this whole field during the First World War, when at Grangegorman in Dublin, and I have a chapter about this in the book, Ireland's first shell shock hospital was opened. And this was the Richmond War Hospital. And, a lot of soldiers, Irishmen in the British Army were sent back with, shell shock and hearing voices and so forth. And they were treated here. Here's a page from the record book. I've blanked out the names in yellow here because I have to, but these were some of the soldiers who were brought in from different companies. And like there were privates and gunners and lieutenants, and there's a sergeant. And the big message about this, why this was so important was, up to this point, lunacy, as it was called, was seen as a form of degeneration that ran in families. But suddenly, during the war, these young men, these, the strongest, the healthiest, as it were coming back with psychological symptoms. This was totally new. So what they did in this hospital, you can see the photo of it there, is they admitted them here, but they didn't certify them as lunatics because it just didn't seem right. Everyone else was certified as a lunatic, but not these soldiers. And they treated them very gently with pain relief, choirs, drama groups, and trips out in the car with the Royal Automobile Association. So none of this spinning them round in chairs, none of this hydrotherapy. The only medication they gave was a form of pain relief called antipyrin and caffeine. And so imagine these guys back from the trenches, and suddenly they're staying in, it is quite a nice building. They're getting fed, they're warm, they're dry, they're getting pain relief, they're getting coffee, there are drama groups coming in, and they're having trips out in the car. Look, everyone got better. And it was so important for the asylums in Ireland and around the world, because it showed that people got better. It showed that people got ill, people got better. So really, really important development at the Richmond 1916 to 1919. And it was reported on in various newspapers. That said, at the start of the 1900s, this is an article in an Irish publication called Studies, 1924. And this is an article called Modern Psychotherapy and Our Asylums. And the author says, the asylums, and this is now, apart from the shell shock one, the asylums are overcrowded, badly staffed, incurable cases are herded in together, there's no treatment, public money is wasted, and the asylums are unsuited in almost every respect. And with this situation happening, something had to be done. So along comes, in Dublin at least, this doctor called John Dunn. And he worked in Grangegorman, and he introduced a succession of treatments, some of which you'll be familiar with, but some of which might be new. So I'm just going to mention two of them. One of them was something called malaria therapy. This was giving people malaria in order to then treat the malaria with quinine. But for a certain kind of patient who was in the asylum because of syphilis affecting their brains, advanced syphilis, this seemed to help. And the person who instigated this therapy initially, Wagner Jauregg, won a Nobel Prize for it in his day. And they literally got mosquitoes and gave people malaria. An astonishing thing. And records indicate that it didn't do much harm. And if anything, it worked. But we'll never fully understand it because we don't see syphilis affecting the brain so much anymore. It's very rare because syphilis can be treated quite easily with antibiotics in most parts of the world. One of the strange treatments. The other treatment is lobotomy. And this is a picture from the US of Walter Freeman. Walter Freeman and his colleague Watts organized a lobotomy for Rosemary Kennedy, some of you may know, the sister of John F. Kennedy. And like many people, virtually everyone who had lobotomy, it was a tragic disaster. Lobotomies were performed in Ireland, but not nearly as many as other countries. We didn't really go in for it in a big way in Ireland, and that's partly because of this belief in institutions, that just being in the hospital was enough. An extraordinary emphasis on institutions in Ireland. So electroconvulsive therapy was introduced at some point, probably in the early 1940s, but it didn't make a huge difference to the number of people in the mental hospitals. Here's a 1950 picture. The hospital had its own pipe band, quite quite an impressive organization, the Grangegorman Pipe Band in 1950. And the asylum grew. Here's a bunch of new buildings. It was essentially unstoppable. So we reached a point whereby in 1961, Ireland had more people in mental hospitals than any other country in the world per head of population. And of course, we didn't have an epidemic of mental illness. What we had was an epidemic of mental hospitals. And just an institutional outburst, with the result, as you see here, that we had such an array of these places. Here's Patrick Quinlan has got together some really good history of the buildings. But change eventually came. Here is Dr. Dunn retiring, 1965, and this person arrived, and this is a very well-known Irish psychiatrist called Ivor Brown. These are his two books, and Ivor set up. He's alive. He's 95. He's very old and not very well at the moment, but he is still alive. And Ivor, you can see here in the newspaper in 1966. This is a Dr. Brown here, literally taking down the walls. With various people from various local councillors and local politicians. You know, the equivalent local politicians were all photographed putting up the walls 200 years earlier. Now they're all getting photographed taking down the walls in 1966. This photograph is from. And so there was a lot of coverage of this movement. And eventually, this is the opening of an outpatient department to try and replace the hospital. And this is what the Grangegorman Hospital looked like for a long time as it slowly became unused. And some of that building, if any of you have seen the film Michael Collins, it was filmed in and around the old disused asylum building that you see there. The front remained in good shape until recently and still looks good. But the inside, as people moved into the community, the buildings literally fell apart inside. So that pretty much gets us to where we are, in a sense, today. If you're interested in this, particularly in Grangegorman, which I wrote the book about, there's a really good movie with called On the Edge, directed by a guy called John Carney. He directed a movie called Once. The song from that won an Oscar a few years ago. But earlier in his career, John Carney filmed this film, On the Edge, about a troubled young man. And he filmed it in St. Brendan's Hospital in Grangegorman as the asylum was falling into misuse. Now, John Carney's mother worked there. She was a psychiatrist, Frances Knott. So I imagine the permission wasn't that hard to get. And this was what it looked like then. And the film features a very young Cillian Murphy, whom some of you might know. He's now become Oppenheimer and other such big parts, but this is a very early film for him, and it really gives a lovely picture of the asylum inside in its declining days. And I like the movie because that's Cillian Murphy, but the actor Stephen Ray plays a psychiatrist who's really cool. And there aren't many movie portrayals that show psychiatrists as stylish and sensitive and cool. So I'm strongly recommending this film. Because that's how we all are, and we wear really nice polo neck jumpers and things like this. So look, my book is about Grangegorman, and it closed. Here's the Irish Times when it closed. In 1906, the place had 2,900 patients, and by the time it closed, you know, it had 54. And you know, most of the patients had been moved into the community, but that 54 of them really kind of tragically, because I was working around there at the time, moving them to the community, they'd been in the asylum so long that this now was their community. There was no community for them other than that. There was no family who wanted them other than that. So we just moved them to a different facility that's all like, you know, to this beautiful, bright facility now. And we no longer have 54 in it. There were all people in later life, and a number of them have died. So the old asylum buildings now have become a university, Technological University Dublin. And look at the beauty of that campus. Just look at the lovely paving and the bright, clean buildings and the open gate and the grassy areas. And it's so sad for those of us who remember this as a hospital that it could have looked this beautiful all along. And it does look amazing now. But it began, as I said, way back as this asylum. It grew during the 1800s, and even interesting progressive figures struggled to make a big change. And then the 1900s saw a lot of new treatments introduced, but really it only was scaled down when Ireland began to change as a country. These were social institutions, really. And I guess the future is, these smaller units, and the future for the Grangegorman campus is as a university. Now, if you're interested in this, there is a more detailed history project going on called Grangegorman Histories.ie, looking at the asylum at Grangegorman, the prison, the workhouse, the other hospitals, the community. And we've a number of events. We've got resources online, kind of virtual exhibitions. So Grangegorman Histories.ie will give you a lot of information and context about this period and this phenomenon in Irish history. And of course, you go to Grangegorman.ie only after you have bought and read and bought multiple copies as gifts this book, Asylum. So I'm very happy to take any questions or observations. I think I saw something in the chat, but I wasn't really looking at it as I went along.
I got them for you. So thank you, Brendan. That was amazing. Siobhan just said that her mom worked in one of the ones that it was her first job, back in, I think, Roscommon. Siobhan, I'll have a look at the comment in a second. And so John asked, which was one of my own first questions, obviously, like, this was very tricky because, and you kind of touched on it when you talked about World War I and how they were able to kind of, not certify them as lunatics because they shell shock. But there must have been all kinds of people in here, like clearly people with learning disabilities maybe, or people, women could be put in by their husbands for kind of no reason. Can you talk to us a little bit about, how easy was it to diagnose somebody with something, particularly because, psychiatry was relatively new, like in the late 19th century. So are they just putting away troublesome people, as well as the fact that some people are kind of volunteering to go in because of the food, and shelter aspect of things? Like, it's incredible to think that 2,500, half the population of a town, are in there, like they can't all be mad, really, or mad.
No, we won't say. We'd get into awful trouble with
I know,
yeah.
But that's actually what I mean, I suppose, that it's not just, mental illness that's going on. It's like, it's learning disabilities, it's troublesome behavior, it's all kinds of things that are being either not diagnosed or misdiagnosed, and they're just being put into this lunatic asylum.
Look, all kinds of things. I mean, I've gone through the records of many of these establishments, and we have to be very careful about diagnosing, but let's just, some of them, there are descriptions of what I would see as very clear symptoms of paranoia and so forth. Some of them, and there are photographs in many of the record books, and some of them are clearly older adults who have had strokes. You can literally see that half of their face is drooping. There's one photograph in one of the records of a woman who is so ill the day she's admitted and so old, that the asylum staff have to hold her head up straight so they can take a photograph of her. And the record said she died a few days later. So the other people who were put in were people with intellectual disability. Now, for a lot of this history, you didn't need a medical certificate to be admitted. So often the doctors would write, this person seems sane, plan, admit to asylum, because they didn't have a choice in the matter. The board decided for a lot of the time. And when medical certificates were introduced, the pattern was so ingrained, it made no difference. Your point about women is really interesting. So I think it's fair to say women fared, particularly badly in terms of the overall institutional load in Ireland. In the asylums, it was about 50-50 men, women, and women, if admitted, they were more likely to be discharged than men were. They were less likely to die in the asylum than men were. So the asylums, if anything, were heavier and more difficult for men. And
Oh,
I was talking to a historian about this, and she was very, very annoyed with me because it just didn't fit
you're
with
right.
where she was headed, and they find it very annoying. But that's also, but she didn't understand the social nature of asylums, because when you look at why the women were discharged, what happened was their husbands came in pleading for them to be sent home to not, you know, not for their well-being,
Yeah.
pleading for them to be sent home to look after the children, to do the cooking and so forth. So in fact, particularly in Ballinasloe, there was a tradition of women trying to get admitted to the asylum for a period. It was called a holiday in the big house.
Wow.
And the real thing it was a holiday from was being pregnant.
Drudgery of domestic, yeah.
Because you see, they were constantly pregnant.
Yeah.
And of course, pregnancy at that time carried a significant risk of death.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
And you could have
so
postpartum depression as well on top of, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, just the most complicated stories. And just think, how bad must your life at home be
Yeah. To
if
want
if
to go in. Yeah. And I think too, Brendan, I could be wrong, like this is anecdotal, but I know, well, it is anecdotal, but we heard stories in Kerry. There was a big one in Killarney too of, I hate to say it, but like alcoholics being sent in for kind of a month or two at a time just to dry out. And, so and that's in the 1960s, so, and probably continued into the 70s and 80s maybe, so there, it's seen as maybe it's a kind of a catch-all, that somebody that's maybe a misfit in the community. I read in one of the reviews of your book in one of the Irish Times or the Irish Independent, they were saying that, sometimes even kind of businessmen who might be in trouble in the community, or if there was a family dispute over a business, that, they could kind of conspire as a family to say, look, we have to get your man in because he's made bad decisions, or, and so there is no doctor assessing you. Like, I believe now to be sectioned at home, like you need 2 doctors, you need police, it's a big thing to get somebody diagnosed today, to go in, which
Oh,
maybe
it
we
is.
go too far, the other side in one way.
Sure. There's a pendulum. There's a pendulum that swings, and it has swung in the other direction now. Certainly here in Ireland, we've a very low number of beds and a very low rate of sectioning or involuntary care,
Yeah.
as you say. The other thing that used to go on was something called wintering in. This is when a family would put often a family member with an intellectual disability into the asylum in the winter, leave them there for the winter and the spring, take them out towards the end of the summer to work on the farm when they were needed, and then put them back in the asylum again for the winter. And this was known as wintering in. And again, it shows how communities and families used the institutions for their own needs.
Yeah, because there's no respite care if you're caring for somebody at home. Yeah.
No, and you see the asylum records also have all these letters from asylum doctors to families saying, look, your family member is now well, will you please come and take them home? And then I came across one letter into Oma Asylum saying, from the family writing into the doctor saying, thank you very much, doctor, we are delighted he is well. However, we cannot take him home, and this could have been a poor family or a family with other kinds of troubles or who knows what. But what they wrote was, we cannot take him home. It's best he stay in the asylum until he dies. Please write to us after he has died.
Oh my gosh.
And they're extraordinarily cruel sounding words to our ears today. But we do need to put ourselves back in that era and say, look, maybe that family had nothing to offer. Maybe they were scattered. Maybe they were poor. Maybe, who knows? Who knows?
I just have to sneeze. That kind of Siobhan just typed a question: could families visit them and things, or were they left there? So yeah, like sometimes they're clearly left there, but they must have been allowed to visit at times, were they? Yeah.
The asylums are sometimes, called hidden institutions, but they weren't even faintly hidden. If half the town is in it and the other half either work in it or they supply it, and every family who had a family member in there knew they were in there. So they weren't hidden, and there was huge coming and going every day, hundreds of staff members in and out, although some of them lived there. You had tradespeople coming and going, you had complex visiting arrangements, and it wasn't tremendously hard to escape from them. People escaped all the time, but the real tragedy of escape stories is that the people who escaped, they never had anywhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
they'd go home or they'd come back themselves
Mm-hmm.
because there wasn't somewhere for them to escape to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there was coming and going, there was visiting, and this was a bit controlled, but it certainly did happen. People
Mm-hmm.
tended to be abandoned if they were left in there over a long period. So very often by the time of their death, family couldn't be found. Or again, in the records, I see asylum doctors writing to families saying, I'm sorry to tell you that, your family member has died, but the letter would often be returned unopened to the asylum. And the postmaster would have written on it, this family has gone to America.
Yeah, gee. So it sounds, Dr. Kelly, like maybe the combination kind of poverty, lack of education. I hate to, kind of say, but you think about, families that had 14 kids so there's bound to be a lot of, kind of birth defects, or I hate, very politically incorrect language, but, so kids that are born maybe with some kind of either disability or something. And so it's not like we have a lot of actually schizophrenics, in there, or people with, actual mental health issues. It's just a kind of a factor of poverty. And I was going to say, is the asylum more seen by the population as more open kind of, or less stigmatizing than something like a mother and baby home or a workhouse, which was absolutely hated, so this was kind of the lesser of the evil options, to a poor peasant family, like.
Oh, it was. And I mean, the workhouses, they were designed to be repellent, in the words of their designers, whereas the asylums were at least designed to be therapeutic. They might have turned out to be anything but. But yeah, and they certainly were more acceptable than a lot of other places. And admission was quite easy.
You're right.
Often, and it was a fairly easy option for families who had a troublesome person, or as you were being very careful and politically correct, just too many people.
Yeah.
There wasn't enough land for them all. There wasn't enough prospect for them all, and some of them might be a bit strange. So they would, so this would suddenly become, from the point of view of a family or a community, this would suddenly become an option. With people saying things like, "Well, at least we know he's safe." And things like this. So to your point, an extraordinary mix of people in for varying periods. As years went on, there was a lot of admission and discharge, a big churn of people, and fewer long term as time went on.
And of course, it must have been horrific if there was, if you were somebody with, Down syndrome or some sort of learning disability, that, if you're in these spinning chairs, that the inhumanity of some of the treatments, did they last long? I mean, I'm blown away by, the lobotomy thing the whole time. I actually think that guy Dunn, or no, not Dunn, whoever you said, that he actually did most of the lobotomies, and apparently in America, particularly of the higher kind of profile people. He himself was responsible for I don't know what percentage of them. But do they continue to use those chairs and the cold water therapy? They do,
yeah, they do. No, they do. They were used for several decades. But the lobotomy is really interesting, and the story of that American surgeon Walter Freeman, there's quite a good book, which you should not buy until you've bought my book. But there's quite a good book by a guy called Jack L. High. The surname is Elhai, two separate words. And it's the life story of Walter Freeman. And it's so interesting because, and he's the guy who really pushed the lobotomies. And he was such a caring fellow. And he saw the big mental hospitals and he thought, oh my, this is horrific. All these people locked up and something has to be done. And then this surgery was invented, not by him, by a guy called Moniz in Portugal, who got a Nobel Prize for it as well. And Freeman took this, and it was this desire to get people out of these awful mental hospitals that really drove Freeman. And his intentions were so good. It's kind of a scary story for medicine that someone with such good intentions and just it just goes too far. There's no mechanism to say, hold on, what are the outcomes here? So now for our treatments, which are much less dramatic, obviously, for mental illness, we do have long-term outcome studies, and they just didn't have those at the time for the lobotomy or the other ones I haven't mentioned. But it's a scary story about how good intentions can if they're let run riot, can go wrong, as you say.
And Brendan, was it just, I mean, this is as a lay woman, was it because you're taking a hammer to the brain that it go, like Frances Farmer was functional after hers, and a lot of people apparently, I read very briefly an article about it, and yet, so obviously it was not the answer for Rosemary Kennedy because she had a developmental delay, so and lobotomy is not going to help her. And I read in a biography of the Kennedy women that he had her recite her 2 times tables and ba ba black sheep until she no longer could. And then he knew to stop hammering. And I thought, oh my God, So if you did not have that developmental delay, a little tap might have hit the emotional center or something of your brain, which could kind of calm you down in the case of Frances Farmer or whoever. Is that what it is? It's just not a scientific, process.
Yeah, it is not it is not a scientific process. And Freeman, would not have argued that he particularly knew what he was doing, but just he argued that the outcomes were good. And when you look at it now, a small number of people, and we in another book I talk about 2 Irish cases where people had severe obsessive compulsive disorder, we would now call it, and they benefited from their lobotomies. It was like magic stopping their obsessive compulsive disorder. And oddly, obsessive compulsive disorder is one of the really, really few conditions where in severe cases, a different kind of brain surgery is now recommended, but brain surgery nonetheless, using kind of implantable things like nothing nearly as destructive would be done now at all.
Through your eyeball.
No, there'd be none of that. But systematically, for the vast majority of people, regardless of the reasons for the operation, they turned out like Rosemary Kennedy, which is to say, significantly disabled by it for the rest of their lives. And it was easily the single greatest mistake in psychiatry, despite the scattered cases that it did benefit, sometimes dramatically benefit. It was more or less random. And we need to remember how misleading the literature is, because it is only those who are able to tell the stories that tell the stories. The ones who were disabled to the point where they couldn't speak, they just lived the rest of their lives in these institutions.
So Siobhan said her mom stayed there, had to sleep there as a trainee nurse in Ballinasloe Lunatic Asylum in the 1940s. And then she said it was quite a scary place, and she left Ireland for London and then eventually America. So I'd imagine that conditions were not great into the 20th century.
No, they weren't, and her mother's experience was common, because for much of the time the staff had to live there. It was mandatory. And certainly, 50 years before then, at the end of the 1800s, if a staff member wanted to spend a night outside the asylum, they had to apply in writing to the medical superintendent and get written permission, or permission slip to go out for the night and back, with the result that sometimes the conditions in which the staff lived in the asylum, they were better, but not a lot better than the patients. So in 1919, when there was a lot of trade unionism and industrial unrest, in Monaghan, the patients and the keepers, that's the nurses and that level of staff members on the ground, they banded together and they formed a Soviet. They ganged up on the doctors and the management. They barricaded them out of Monaghan Asylum, and they raised the red flag over the asylum and established a Soviet until they negotiated better pay and conditions. And this was patients and staff banding together to do this. Against the management committee and the doctors, who were always seen as evil.
Well, it sounds like, as you said, I was amazed at how beautiful the buildings were even. So, there is, they're like Tudor manors, so there is this desire, I think, to do good at the crux, at the kind of underneath the whole thing. And then it's just unfortunate. And look, in a way, we still know so little, we have quite high suicide rates still. I think they've brought electric shock therapy back, even though it had been kind of, out of favor in the 70s and 80s. But, it does appear to work for certain manic depressions and things, I think. So I guess we're still sort of learning, you know, how to treat all of these things, and social pressure has made it harder, and now of course social media harder again.
Yeah.
So I think I'm kind of heartened by the fact that there was a desire to do good rather than like a punishment or a let's
Yeah.
hide them from society, you know.
There was always a desire to do good. And so, two things on that. Well, that's good. There was a desire to do good, and there still is.
Yeah,
But then it's a bit scary just
yeah.
how far off the beam that desire to do good can go. And as I say, today, there's huge emphasis. So, for example, for schizophrenia and the medications we use, just last year there was this amazing 20-year follow-up study asking, in the real world, it was a study in Finland looking at everyone with schizophrenia in Finland over a period of 20 years on medication or off medication, what are the benefits? And, came very strongly in favor of the treatment. But these are the kinds of long-term 20-year follow-up studies that just weren't available for lobotomy. And it was a process of gradual realization, and that the good intentions had gone seriously
Wow. Yeah.
astray.
Well, and you know, you have a vulnerable population, so the chances are things can go wrong, you know, and then a big institution. And I suppose, Brendan, today, certainly we're very aware of it here in America, but like the power of big pharma, you know, you hear about that a lot. Is that something that, you know, you guys in Ireland are worried about, or, you know, has medication helped kind of bridge some of that, you know, that look, if something works, it works, and that's great, you know?
Yeah, I mean, people talk about the power of big pharma all the time, and it is powerful. I mean, health systems can be designed in a certain way to minimize these kinds of negative effects. The other thing people talk about are the power of diagnostic systems like DSM, which, sort of create new diagnoses. But the way that health systems are designed can obviate an awful lot of that. So, for example, I'm a psychiatrist as well. I did a PhD in history at some point along the way to try and understand this stuff better. But fundamentally, like, I'm a medical doctor, I'm a psychiatrist, and like most psychiatrists here in Ireland, I'm just employed by the government.
Yeah, yeah,
And we do no office practice or private practice at all. We work in multidisciplinary teams. We're paid what we're paid. We don't. There's no pressure on us to diagnose people, to make insurance claims. Insurance just
yeah.
isn't a feature of our lives. So we're really dramatically different to the United States for the most part. And the way these public systems are organized, the impact of things like diagnostic systems, the impact of things like big pharma is much, much less. I mean, clearly, they are the only ones researching new medications and bringing them to market. So, there's also good going on there, but they're sort of manipulative. I mean, they're trying to sell tablets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
That's
it's
what
a
they're doing.
sales thing. Yeah, yeah,
And in fairness to them, they're very clear about that. We're trying to sell tablets. And, if you believe everything that a used car salesman tells you, then, more fool you.
yeah,
But
yeah,
the incentives are different when you're a public sector employee.
yeah, yeah. No, that's great. Um, you've given us a lot of food for thought. I have ordered copies of the book for the shop. You'll be delighted to know, everyone. But of course, you can purchase it online if you can't wait until we get it in. And we'd be delighted to have you back. I didn't realize you had a PhD in history as well. I think that's brilliant. So you were telling the truth about setting other historians straight because you knew.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I'm very keen that this history, is properly founded, as it
yeah,
were,
yeah, yeah.
because it is complex. And above all, it's a very social history, these hospitals. They're about people using institutions far more than they are about mental illness.
Yeah,
As you've been hinting there,
yeah,
it's far more about poverty and the way we set up societies and what communities need and communities do when you build any institution.
yeah,
It gets used for other purposes. And
yeah.
that's ultimately what that history is about.
Yeah, well, and it sounds, you know, positively for me that the community were able to use it rather than the system taking
Hmm.
people out of the community, you know, so it wasn't a kind of a, you know, mother and baby homes where you're sent in and you're
Yeah.
trapped, and, you know, and so I don't know if that's the absence of the church or just the fact that it was a more, you know, we were overcrowded and you seem to be cured, so good luck to you, you know, or yeah.
Yeah. But
Mhm.
the absence of the church is interesting. The other thing interesting, if anyone listening is familiar with American psychiatry, is the absence of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
Never,
Never it
never,
reached Ireland. Well, didn't he
never
say
feature.
famously that we were not capable of being, what was his word? The Irish can't be analyzed
Can't
or
be
something.
analyzed. I
Yeah.
mean, that appeared in a
Makes us feel
Scorsese
himself.
film, and like that, just he never said that.
Oh,
That's
he
just
didn't?
not
Okay,
true.
good.
No. But we love it, you
Yeah,
know.
we do. Yeah, yeah. But it obviously took root at some point. How did that bypass Ireland? Was it just we were still not independent kind of when his work came out and we
Well,
didn't have the
there's
time?
kind of two reasons. Number one is we believed in institutions.
You're
That's
right.
why we weren't so enthusiastic about lobotomy. We weren't so enthusiastic about insulin coma therapy. We weren't too enthusiastic about psychoanalysis. We weren't too enthusiastic about any of these treatments. We tried them, except the other thing is the church absolutely opposed psychoanalysis. It
Mm.
said it was against God and against the church. And that had a chilling impact on anyone who might. I mean, in the 1940s, Ireland had exactly 5 psychoanalysts in it, whereas in the US, psychoanalysis totally dominated psychiatry for a very long period of time. So the other thing that we have to thank the church for, interestingly, is there was a lot of eugenics, eugenics in
Mhm.
European asylums. But it never really impacted in Ireland because the church felt that reproduction was solely its area and it
Yeah,
wouldn't let anyone else interfere with it.
yeah.
So that was mostly negative, but it did have the plus that it meant the kind of mass sterilization of the mentally ill that happened across Europe never happened in
And
Ireland
in
because the
America,
church.
right through the
And
70s. Yeah, they did. California, there was I can't remember the name of the book, but there's an amazing study done in California. They were doing it right into the 70s, without
just
the patient's knowledge
without
or
consent.
consent, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Shocking.
astonishing story, and
Mhm.
it didn't happen much in Ireland, and the rather paradoxical reason is that the Roman Catholic Church regarded reproductive matters as solely its domain, so
Yeah.
nobody else would be doing anything.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm sorry now we'll have to have you back because I know it's really late for you, but you've just spurred, I'm wondering about the whole mother and child scheme and Noel Brown and these efforts by particularly Noel Brown as a doctor to
Mm.
try to modernize medicine, but it looks like maybe our mental health institutions were not in need kind of interference by the church because they were already not doing the wrong thing in the church's eyes, Yeah,
Indeed, indeed,
yeah.
indeed, and I think sometimes the church, yeah, but I mean the church was more or less obsessed with women and with reproduction,
Yeah, yeah,
with women, as in terms of reproduction, and
yeah.
that wasn't really a big thing in the asylums. And in earlier times, there was this notion of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And look, the
Mhm.
people with severe mental illness and intellectual disability and homelessness, they didn't, they mostly would have come under the undeserving poor.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, they were happily ignored by the powers that be. Mhm.
Indeed.
Well, look, thank you very much, Dr. Kelly. This was amazing. Thank you all for joining us. I should remind you, we have our Christmas market at Celtic Hall on New Carner Road on Saturday, and then on Sunday in the museum. And I don't think we'll be able to live stream it. We'll see if we can figure it out. We have Christmas in Ireland with Eileen Egan Mack and a pianist. So that'll just be a little kind of light show. And your December newsletter will be coming out soon with we are continuing our Irish and series. So we'll be looking at the Irish and the Italians in America. And we'll have film club as usual. So just keep an eye for your newsletter. And thank you, Dr. Kelly. I'm sorry we kept you so late, but I really appreciated it. And we'll have you back at some time.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Take care. Thanks.